not lower the cost of your health care. It will not protect children. It will not ease the strain on doctors and other health care providers. What it will do is interfere with parental choice and open private medical data up to federal investigation. It threatens to jail doctors who follow evidence-based practice supported by every medical association in the United States. It deprives children of proven life-saving medical care. My Republican colleagues should be ashamed. I'm ashamed of what they're doing. I'm ashamed that trans children out there may see this debate in the People's House and watch elected officials lie about them. I'm ashamed that the world sees this democracy spending its time wielding the law as a weapon to attack a few rather than use the law as a shield to protect the vulnerable. And I'm furious that while millions of families struggle to afford.
You watch him unravel his own colleagues on the House floor, and something ancient stirs within every American soul that still remembers what democracy was supposed to be before it was hijacked by fear merchants and culture warriors, because Representative Mark Takano just delivered what may be the most important intervention we have seen in years on the floor of the People's House. And this is not hyperbole, this is not partisan cheerleading, this is historical reckoning in real time, as just days ago on December 17th, the House passed H.R. 3492 by a vote of 21-6 to 211, bringing us to the precipice of a moral catastrophe so profound that future generations will study this moment as the inflection point where America chose either to defend its most vulnerable citizens or to sacrifice them on the altar of political expediency and electoral manipulation. Because what you just witnessed was not merely a speech about healthcare policy or bureaucratic procedure, but a clarion call against the most extreme federal attack on bodily autonomy and medical freedom we have seen in modern American history, and the rage you heard in his voice, the shame he expressed on behalf of his colleagues, is the appropriate response to legislation that would make it a federal crime for medical professionals to prescribe puberty blockers, hormone therapy, and other kinds of gender-affirming healthcare to trans youth, with penalties so draconian that providers could face hefty fines and up to 10 years in federal prison just for following the guidance of their professional medical organizations. Wait, because we need to drill deeper into what Takano is exposing here. Marjorie Taylor Greene's bill, dubbed the Protect Children's Innocence Act, bans all gender-affirming care nationwide and makes it a felony offense, and this is the same Marjorie Taylor Greene who has routinely described puberty blockers as a form of mutilation while failing to cite evidence for her claims, and now her legislative fever dream has passed through the House with the blessing of a Republican majority so consumed by culture war theatrics that they have elevated cruelty to the level of national policy. The sheer audacity of calling this atrocity the Protect Children's Innocence Act is Orwellian propaganda of the highest order, because what this bill actually does, according to Takano's devastating breakdown, is strip away parental rights, interfere with the sacred physician-patient relationship, penalize parents, guardians, or any U.S. citizens who help trans young people access care overseas under similar penalties, which means that loving parents who simply want their children to survive adolescence could face federal prosecution for the crime of caring. And here is where it gets even more sinister, because the bill criminalizes care that trans youth, their families, doctors, and nearly every legitimate professional association agree is necessary, safe, and beneficial, while explicitly endorsing irreversible non-consensual surgeries on intersex infants, revealing that this has nothing whatsoever to do with protecting children and everything to do with enforcing rigid binary gender stereotypes through state violence. The intellectual dishonesty is staggering when you consider that every major medical organization in the U.S., including the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the American Psychological Association, supports gender-affirming healthcare treatment, such as puberty blockers. More than 2,000 scientific studies have examined aspects of gender-affirming care since 1975, including more than 260 studies cited in the Endocrine Society's Clinical Practice Guideline. Yet Republican legislators backed by extremist organizations funded by dark money networks have decided that their theological commitments and political calculations outweigh the consensus of the entire medical establishment. This is the 21st century equivalent of Lysenkoism, where pseudoscience backed by state power overrides empirical research and clinical expertise because it serves the ideological agenda of authoritarians who cannot tolerate the existence of people who challenge their narrow worldview. And what Takano is pointing to when he says this legislation threatens to jail doctors who follow evidence-based practice is that we are witnessing the criminalization of medicine itself because House Judiciary Committee Republicans voted to advance a bill that would throw parents and doctors in jail for providing medically necessary care to young trans people in another attempt by extremist Republican politicians to simultaneously further their anti-transgender agenda and distract the American people from their recently passed reconciliation scheme. Now watch what happens next, because this escalation did not emerge from a vacuum. This is the culmination of a multi-year strategy orchestrated by right-wing think tanks and Christian nationalist organizations who have been workshopping these attacks in state legislatures across the country, turning trans children into political pawns in a larger project to roll back civil rights gains across multiple fronts. And state laws and policies prohibiting or restricting minor access to gender-affirming care have proliferated in recent years, with Arkansas being the first state to pass such a law in 2021. And as of June 2025, 25 bans remain in place following a Supreme Court decision that gave states carte blanche to deny health care to vulnerable youth. The architecture of oppression has been methodically constructed, with an unprecedented 1020 bills under consideration across the country in 2025 that would negatively impact trans and gender nonconforming people, representing what can only be described as a legislative onslaught designed to exhaust advocates, overwhelm community resources, and normalize discrimination at scale. And the Republican Party has weaponized this marginalized community with such ferocity. The DOP operatives spent an astounding $222 million on anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ+ advertising, more than on housing, immigration, and the economy combined, during the 2024 election cycle, proving that cruelty is not just a byproduct of their political strategy, it is the entire point, because what Representative Takano articulated with such moral clarity is that this is not really about medicine or child welfare or parental rights. This is about wielding the law as a weapon to attack the few, rather than as a shield to protect the vulnerable, and that distinction is everything, because it reveals the authoritarian impulse at the heart of contemporary conservatism, which cannot abide the existence of difference, and therefore must mobilize state power to eradicate it. The trauma inflicted on trans youth by this legislation is not incidental, it is the intended outcome, because Republicans have calculated that manufacturing a moral panic around transgender people serves their electoral interests, even if it means sacrificing the lives and well-being of thousands of children in the process, and we know that a 2022 study published in the Journal of Adolescent Health found trans youth were significantly less likely to be depressed or suicidal when prescribed puberty blockers, while rates of anxiety and depression for transgender youth are as much as 10 times greater than those of their cisgender peers, resulting in alarmingly high rates of suicidal ideation and behaviors, with evidence showing that transgender or non-binary youth who experience discrimination have higher rates of depressive mood, seriously considering suicide attempts, and multiple suicide attempts, though this higher suicide risk is not unavoidably associated with transgender or non-binary status, but instead is the result of stigma, discrimination, and mistreatment. This is state-sanctioned violence masquerading as child protection, and the hypocrisy is laid bare when you examine the intersex exception, because H.R. 3492 is the first bill of its kind to admit that the childhood intersex surgeries it exempts are a form of genital mutilation, with the wording plainly stating that genital or bodily mutilation is not a violation if it is performed on a child with an intersex variation, exposing the entire edifice of their argumentation as fraudulent, because if they truly cared about protecting children from irreversible medical interventions, they would be banning the non-consensual surgeries performed on intersex infants. Instead, they are explicitly endorsing those procedures while criminalizing consensual evidence-based care that transgender adolescents receive with the informed consent of their families and medical teams. The cruelty is the point, and the contradiction is the confession, because what they are really saying is that bodily autonomy is contingent on conformity to their ideology, and anyone who deviates from the gender binary they wish to enforce through legislation must be punished. And Takano's fury is righteous when he condemns his colleagues for spending precious legislative time on this vindictive, petty garbage, while millions of families struggle to afford groceries, healthcare, and rent, because the same Republican majority that just criminalized transgender healthcare done absolutely nothing to address the material conditions crushing working families across this country, instead choosing to pour their energy into persecuting a tiny fraction of the population, because it energizes their evangelical base and distracts from their utter failure to govern. This is the politics of deflection taken to its logical extreme, where culture war grievances are elevated above economic justice, and the machinery of government is repurposed to inflict suffering on marginalized communities, rather than to ameliorate the structural inequalities that produce poverty, precarity for millions. The House Republicans who voted for this abomination will head out of town for the year, concluding an embarrassing and deeply out-of-touch 2025 that saw them start and end the year with attacks on trans youth while ignoring the needs of the country, and history will remember them as cowards who prioritized bigotry over basic human decency. But here is the part that should terrify every American regardless of where you stand on this particular issue. Because once you establish the precedent that politicians can override medical expertise, criminalize evidence-based care, that they find ideologically objectionable, you have opened the door to state control over all healthcare decisions, and this is exactly what the Trump administration has been doing, because first the House passed Rep. Marjorie Taylor Greene's H.R. 3492, which would make providing or seeking gender-affirming care for minors a crime. Then the White House unleashed what trans journalist Aaron Reed called the single most aggressive attack on transgender healthcare in U.S. history, a proposed rule that would bar Medicaid-dependent hospitals from providing gender-affirming care to minors. And finally, the House voted to cut coverage for youth gender-affirming care, creating a multi-pronged assault designed to eliminate access to this care nationwide regardless of state law. The federal government is now threatening to cut off federal Medicaid and Medicare funding from hospitals that provide gender-affirming care to children and prohibit federal Medicaid dollars from being used to fund such procedures, which means that hospitals will be forced to choose between providing medically necessary care and maintaining their ability to serve the broader patient population that depends on federal healthcare funding, and this strategy of financial coercion bypasses the normal legislative process and allows the executive branch to impose a de facto national ban without ever securing the votes in the Senate. The language used by Trump administration officials reveals the theocratic impulses underlying this policy, because acting CDC Director Jim O'Neill said men are men, men can never become women, women are women, women can never become men, adding that the blurring of the lines between sexes represented a hatred for nature, as God designed it, which is an explicitly religious justification for denying health care, being offered by a federal public health official in a country that supposedly maintains separation of church and state. This is Christian nationalism in practice, where theological convictions about gender and sexuality are encoded into federal policy and used to justify the withdrawal of medical care from children whose very existence challenges fundamentalist orthodoxy. And when Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said doctors and medical groups had peddled the lie that these treatments could be good for children, and that those youth were conditioned to believe that sex can be changed, he is not engaging with the scientific literature or responding to clinical evidence. He is simply asserting his ideological priors and demanding that the entire medical establishment conform to his worldview. The response from medical professionals has been unequivocal because the American Academy of Pediatrics, which represents 67,000 pediatricians across the country, pushed back forcefully, stating that these policies and proposals misconstrue the current medical consensus and fail to reflect the realities of pediatric care and the needs of children and families, while the American Psychological Association wrote that it is deeply concerned about recent federal actions that not only challenge the scientific understanding of gender identity, but also potentially jeopardize the human rights, psychological health, and well-being of transgender and non-binary individuals. This is not a he said, she said situation where there are two equally valid perspectives on the science. This is a scenario where the overwhelming weight of medical evidence and clinical expertise points in one direction, and right-wing politicians backed by extremist ideologues are demanding that we ignore reality in favor of their prejudices. And what makes this particularly insidious is that a large body of medical literature demonstrates that with support at home, school, and in the community, and with access to gender-affirming care, transgender youth do as well on mental health measures as their non-transgender peers, meaning that the intervention being criminalized is precisely the one that allows these children to thrive. The stakes could not be higher because we are watching in real time as 25 states now outlaw gender-affirming care for youth, up from one Arkansas in 2021, which means half of all trans young people cannot access care. And the expansion of these bans has created a healthcare refugee crisis, where families are forced to relocate to states that still protect access, or to pursue care underground, risking legal consequences. Parents like one Massachusetts mother with a 15-year-old transgender daughter report a growing sense of fear because of federal government actions, with the conversation in her family constantly being, "Where is our red line when we need to flee the country?" Which means that American families are now discussing whether they need to seek asylum in other countries to protect their children from their own government. And if that does not shake you to your core, then you have not been paying attention to history, because this is how democracies die, not with a sudden coup, but through the incremental erosion of rights and the systematic persecution of vulnerable populations until entire communities are forced into hiding or exile. the broader implications extend far beyond the transgender community, because this is part of a larger authoritarian project articulated in documents like Project 2025, which equates being transgender or adopting transgender ideology to pornography, and declares that it should be outlawed, with the federal government enforcing sex discrimination laws on the biological binary meaning of sex, and educators and public librarians who spread the concept of being transgender being registered as sex offenders, revealing that the end goal is not just to deny health care, but to erase trans people from public life entirely by criminalizing any acknowledgement of their existence. This is eliminationist rhetoric translated into policy. The plan says that children should be raised by their biological fathers and mothers, who conceive them unless those biological parents are found unfit by a court, which has obvious implications for LGBTQ parents, adoptive families, and anyone else who does not conform to their narrow definition of what constitutes a legitimate family structure. The connections between these various forms of oppression are not coincidental. They are part of a coherent ideological vision, rooted in Christian nationalist theology, and funded by networks of right-wing billionaires who see cultural transformation as essential to their economic and political agenda. What Takano called vindictive petty garbage is actually much worse than that. It is systematic persecution designed to make life unlivable for an entire population, and in the wake of the suicide of former Middlebury College swimmer Leah Smith, trans journalist Aaron Reed argued that policies designed to make life unlivable for transgender people bear responsibility too, with every trans suicide being a murder by those in power, and by making life for trans youth too difficult to bear, the GOP is hell-bent on a genocide by suicide. This is not rhetorical excess. This is an accurate description of the foreseeable consequences of these policies, because when you systematically deny people access to necessary medical care, when you criminalize their existence, when you tell them through law and policy that they are not worthy of protection or dignity, when you expose them to relentless hostility and discrimination, the mental health impacts are catastrophic, and Republicans know this. They understand that these policies will lead to increased rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide among transgender youth, and they have decided that this outcome is acceptable because it serves their larger political objectives. The resistance to this barbarism must be total and uncompromising, because what is at stake is nothing less than the principle that all people have inherent dignity and worth, regardless of their gender identity, and that medical decisions should be made by patients' families, doctors, not by politicians seeking to impose their religious beliefs through legislation. A recent survey by the Human Rights Campaign and Global Strategy Group of voters in U.S. House battleground districts found that 73% of battleground voters say Congress should not pass a law that would jail doctors or parents for providing transition-related care, including more than half of Republican voters, which means that these policies are not just morally reprehensible, they are also politically unpopular, even among the Republican base. But the GOP is not responding to public opinion. They are responding to the demands of their most extreme donors and the imperatives of their culture war strategy, which requires them to continually escalate their attacks on marginalized communities to maintain the sense of crisis that justifies their authoritarian power grabs. So when Takano says he is ashamed that trans children out there may see this debate in the people's house, watch elected officials lie about them. He is speaking to a profound truth about the psychological violence inflicted by this rhetoric, because these children are listening when politicians describe their health care as mutilation, when legislators compare gender-affirming care to child abuse, when their very existence is treated as a political problem to be solved through criminalization, and the message they receive is that they are not valued, that they do not belong, that the world would be better off without them, and this is the intended effect, because if you can make people feel sufficiently worthless and hopeless, they will remove themselves from the political equation, and the work of elimination becomes much easier. This is trauma as political strategy, and it is being deployed with full knowledge of its consequences, because Republicans have been running this playbook for years, attacking LGBTQ people, demonizing immigrants, scapegoating racial minorities, and every time they do it, they push the boundaries of acceptable political discourse further toward open fascism. The shame that Takano invokes is not his to bear alone. It belongs to every American who has remained silent in the face of this escalating persecution, to every Democrat who has equivocated or distanced themselves from trans rights because they feared the electoral consequences, to every journalist who has both sides this issue, as if there were legitimate debates about whether trans people deserve basic human rights, because there is no middle ground between affirming the dignity and humanity of transgender people and criminalizing their existence. There is no compromise position between following medical evidence and imposing theocratic restrictions on healthcare, and anyone who pretends otherwise is complicit in the violence being perpetrated against this community. As Rep. Mark Takano stated, this bill is the most extreme anti-transgender legislation to ever pass through the House of Representatives and a direct attack on the rights of parents to work with their children and their doctors to provide them with the medical care they need, and if this bill becomes law, doctors, pharmacists, and in some circumstances, the parents of young trans people would face time in prison for choosing to prioritize their child's health. The path forward requires more than just defensive advocacy. We need an affirmative vision of healthcare justice that centers bodily autonomy and recognizes that all people have the right to make decisions about their own bodies in consultation with medical professionals without interference from the state. We need to dismantle the networks of right-wing organizations that have been funding and coordinating these legislative attacks across the country, exposing the dark money flows and the ideological infrastructure that enables this systematic persecution. We need to organize mass resistance at every level, from local school boards to state legislatures to Congress, making it politically impossible for Republicans to continue this campaign of eliminations violence without facing consequences. And we need to fundamentally restructure our healthcare system so that access to necessary medical care is not contingent on where you live or what politicians happen to be in power, but is instead guaranteed as a human right. This is the fight of our generation, and it will determine whether we live in a democracy that protects the vulnerable or an authoritarian state that persecutes those who deviate from imposed norms. Because once you accept the principle that the government can criminalize evidence-based medical care for one population based on ideological objections, there is no limiting principle that prevents them from extending that logic to other forms of healthcare and other communities. Today it is transgender youth, tomorrow it could be reproductive healthcare, or HIV prevention, or any other medical intervention that offends the sensibilities of Christian nationalists who have captured the Republican Party and are using their political power to impose their theology on the rest of us. The line must be drawn here, and the answer must be an unequivocal no. We will not allow you to sacrifice vulnerable children on the altar of your culture war. We will not stand by while you criminalize medicine and persecute families. We will fight you at every turn with every resource at our disposal until this monstrous legislation is defeated and the rights and dignity of all people are secured. Representative Takano's righteous anger and moral clarity in that moment on the House floor was a gift to all of us, because it modeled the kind of uncompromising advocacy that this moment demands: no hedging, no equivocation, no concern for appearing too strident or partisan, just the raw truth that what Republicans are doing is shameful and unconscionable and must be opposed with every fiber of our being. Because when they come for the most vulnerable among us, when they weaponize the law to attack rather than to protect, when they elevate cruelty to the level of policy, the only appropriate response is the one Takano gave: total moral condemnation and a commitment to resist this barbarism with everything we have. The trans youth watching this debate need to know that they are not alone, that there are people in positions of power who see them and value them and will fight for their right to exist and to access the health care they need, and the rest of us need to be worthy of that trust by joining that fight with the urgency and ferocity it demands, because there is no time left for incrementalism or political calculation. This is the moment where we decide what kind of country we are going to be, and history is watching.